So first of all, the question is that what is the recurrence rate of the shoulder dystocia? 2-fold, 4-fold, 6-fold, 8-fold, or 10-fold?
E, tenfold.
Yeah, the risk is tenfold, so E is the correct answer. And what exactly is shoulder dystocia?
It's the impaction of the anterior shoulder, posterior shoulder from the
Yeah, impaction of the anterior shoulder, shoulders behind the pubic bone like that, okay? And the risk of recurrence, if we count, it is actually 1 to 25% as mentioned in the guideline. Risk of recurrence is 1 to 1% to 25%, and but then in the middle of the guideline they have written that the risk of having this recurrence is 10%, tenfold, 10 times higher, not 10%, tenfold higher. Once she had this shoulder dystocia, she's going to have it like 10 times higher chance as compared to the general population. The problem with the shoulder dystocia is that there are very poor predictions about it because the factors are not like very specific. So it can occur in any pregnancy. And 48% children, they will be of the very normal size, and the mothers, they won't be having this CPD. Okay, just remember the maneuvers, and then in how much time we are going to do that. And then another likely question is that in which when you will say that this shoulder dystocia is because of mistake of the birth attendant, when anterior shoulder is stuck or the posterior shoulder is stuck.
You mean a mistake of the doctor?
Yeah, birth cashier, like the one who is helping her. Anterior. Why? Why anterior? Because if the anterior is stuck, then it means that the attendant has been asking the patient to push. So sometimes they ask you another question that you are recognizing the case of shoulder dystocia, and what will be your first action? So the first action would be to stop mother from pushing the baby. She should stop pushing because if you will continue pushing, then the baby is going to be stuck behind the shoulders, stuck behind the pubic bone, and then it would be mistake of the of the birth attendant. Then you need to fill everything on a printed pro forma. Why? Because of the medical legal like that. That is important. So it should be written in black, and it is very important. And then, is it reportable or not?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, you have to write a serious incident report like that. It is important for your prevention and for preventing your team also. Okay, so the question number 2 is, what is the incidence of uterine rupture before labor if the patient had a previous classical cesarean section? So classical cesarean section, because inherently it is going to be, since we are cutting a larger area, so this type of C-section is going to be associated with higher chance of scar rupture like that.
Yeah.
So here this is a smart question because they asked you that what is the chance before labor, uterine rupture before labor.
Before
So
labor.
yeah, because everyone knows that in the labor, if they ask you what is the patient is in active labor, so what is the chance of having a ruptured uterus? 5%. If he's
5%.
already in the labor, so here the risk is going to be 2%. So then the question is, what is this? Why this 0.5% is there?
Yeah.
Because even if there is like unscarred uterus, the risk of rupture during labor is going to be 0.5%, because in the end of the pregnancy, when the woman is laboring, the uterus is really very thin. So even on an unscarred uterus, the risk of rupture is going to be like 0.5%. And if the patient had a classical cesarean section, the risk of rupture pre-labor is going to be 2% in the antenatal period. And this patient, we have to take precautions that she will not go into labor. And we have to deliver them prematurely also, like at 36 weeks, or at the most you will deliver at 37 weeks. But why? Because in view of the very high chance of unacceptable risk, very high chance of having this ruptured uterus. So if she goes into labor, then the risk is going to be 5%. That is one thing. Okay. So
Okay.
the classical C-section, if a woman has a classical cesarean section, in how many layers you are going to close it? In 3 layers. Okay. You will
3
close
layers.
that. You will close that in 3 layers. So how 3 layers? You will take first layer. You will take second layer, and then you will take another layer. Why? Because you would like to cover you would like to cover all of these you'll like to bury the previous 2 layers in it. That is one thing. Okay. So the chance is going to
Okay.
be like it will be like this one. The 3 layers. So 2 layers you are just switching in the first layer you are just taking the this inner 1/3 of the this layer myometrium. We will not take endometrium. Okay. And then in rest of it you are taking, in the second layer you are taking the rest of myometrium, and then we are burying the second layer by the third layer. So that is one thing. Okay. So
Okay.
longitudinal margin, so obviously it is going to be associated with more complications like that. So what are the indications for doing a classical cesarean section? When do we offer this classical section?
If morbid obese patient,
Morbidly obese patient, yeah, you cannot identify placenta previa. If the large fibroids are occupying the lower segment, then if the baby is malpresented, and then if very preterm and there is preform, because the lower segment is not formed, so it is very hard to take the baby out in a preterm cesarean section. Okay, especially if there is malpresentation. So that is an important consideration. Okay.
so in this question, the answer is 5% or
Two,
percent before labor.
2%,
Yeah.
2% pre-labor, right? And if they tell you like it is in the labor, if the patient has started laboring, then your answer is going to be like 5%. That is one thing. Okay, that will be like 5%. So like sometimes the questions, they can be like very simple, and some of them can be like very much complicated. Okay. So the question number 3 is that a patient is with SLE, systemic lupus erythematosus, and so she has tested positive for anti-Ro and anti-LA antibodies. What is the risk of third degree heart block in her baby? So she has like these antibodies, and the congenital heart block, it can occur, and then the problem is like this type of problem, it occurs like what will happen to the baby. These anti-Ro and anti-LA antibodies, they will just cross the placenta, and they can destroy the Purkinje system, Purkinje fibers of the developing myocardium of the baby. So the conduction velocity will be low. So it can cause fetal brady, because actually the main function is taken up by the SA node. But if the SA node is contracting and is conducting impulses, but they are not getting through, because what happens, the information will go from the SA node to the AV node and then to the his Purkinje system. So if his Purkinje system is also not working, like the muscles have been destroyed, then this baby is going to have a bradycardia. So the chance of having this problem is 2 to 3% if the woman has like this is given in the guideline. So if she has like if she has like there is risk of 2 to 3% if she's having like anti-Ro and LA bodies. So here the answer will be like, what will be the answer? So 2 to 3%. So
2%.
we will, yeah, so we will go to like 2%. 2%. Okay, so the answer is 2%. And then sometimes they can ask you, sometimes they will ask you that the baby is having a baby's heart is beating very slowly, or the heart rate is very low on CTG. So what is the cause? So what is likely to be present in mother's serum? Then your answer is anti-Ro and anti-LA antibodies. Anti-Ro and anti-LA. That is one. Another question is that a patient with SLE, she has tested positive for anti-Ro and anti-LA antibodies, and her first baby has third degree heart block. So what is the risk of third degree heart block in her second pregnancy? So again, the guideline says that now the risk is like 16%. Risk of recurrence will be 16%. So we go to the nearest number. Okay, so 50 will be very
Okay.
far. So we will stay with number with D, that is 50. That is the chance of recurrence. That is one thing. Okay. Then the question number 5 is that a primary gravida is in second stage of labor, and if you need to infiltrate her perineum with lignocaine without vasopressin, how much should be given? So we are not giving vasopressin,
5.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
D.
So you are not giving like vasopressin. 5 will be very high. Without vasopressin, you will give 3. Like if her weight is 60, then you are going to give her like 180 milligrams. Okay. So without any vasopressin, we are going to give 3 mg. If we are giving with vasoactive substance like vasopressin, that is the purpose is that it will cause vasoconstriction, and all of this drug, it will stay in the vicinity, in the area where we want to do the procedure. Okay, so if you are giving it with vasopressin, then you need to give 7 milligrams per kg. So be very specific and answer this question. If it is without vasopressin, you will give 3 mg per kg. If it is with vasopressin, you are going to give 7 mg. Okay,
Yeah.
so this vasopressin they are saying here, but in practice we are using adrenaline. Okay, so vasopressin has the same action, so that's why they said vasopressin here. So the maximum dose that we can give is like we can give like 200 milligrams. If we are giving it, this is for the lignocaine or lidocaine. The maximum dose will be 200 milligram. Okay, and if you will give it with adrenaline, then you will have to give like 500 mg. Usually they are not asking about the maximum dose, but you should remember that maximum dose will be 200 mg if we are giving only lignocaine or lidocaine, and it will be like 500 mg if we are giving it like giving lidocaine with adrenaline. That is one thing. Okay, so if we talk about bupivacaine, if they give you bupivacaine, okay, if the bupivacaine is given in the system, then the dose is 2 milligrams per kg, and the maximum dose which can be given safely is 150 milligrams. But bupivacaine, they are not asking you as such, they are asking you that your patient is going for conscious sedation. So what should be given to her? So if you have you seen them giving this conscious sedation, what do they give to the patient? Bupivacaine, okay, and then fentanyl and lidocaine. 3 things they are giving, right, in the conscious sedation.
Okay.
When do we give this conscious sedation by them? Like when
Not sure.
yeah, go on, please, go on. If you're doing outpatient hysteroscopy and the patient is not relaxed, okay, then if you're
Okay.
doing manual vacuum aspiration, okay, then you're doing this. In these conditions, when you have to remove a polyp, like you're going to do this outpatient procedure, where generally anesthesia is not required, but your patient is like this, that she has like she's not tolerating pain well, because everyone has different tolerance for pain. That is the point. Okay,
Okay.
that is
Yeah.
the point. Okay, so the question number 6 is a 25-year-old woman with vaginal discharge. She has been diagnosed with chlamydia trachomatis, and she declined to take any medications for it, any medicine for it. So what percentage of such infections is likely to resolve spontaneously if left untreated for 1 year? People, they like to try different methods. Okay, so sometimes they don't want to take the medicines because they have seen their friends or someone who took the medicine, but what happened, um, this the infection didn't go away like that. Okay, so that's why they are not very happy, and they don't want to take treatment. Sometimes they like to take herbal medicines, like you must have seen, like they are trying different things, like they're using this barley water, right? Some people they like to use different types of cleansing objects, solutions. Why? Because they think that it is going to clear their infection. So even basically it is asking you that what is the chance that if the patient is left untreated. So will she be able to clear this infection? Yes, 50% chance that even if she takes nothing for it, this infection will be cleared. So 50% A is the answer for this one. Okay, 50%
Okay.
chance like that. Similarly, this is the rationale behind not treating CIN1. Why? Or if the patient is found to be positive with low grade HPV, so we can also leave them. That is also a reason that there is gap between cervical sampling. Why? Cervical screening, because we anticipate that in a certain period of time, the given period of time, this infection will be cleared. Okay, so her system will be clear, so she will not have any problem like that, because the natural immunity, it also plays a role in clearing infections. But these infections, we need to tell them that these patients are at very high risk of developing other complications, so they should be managed properly. So in this age group, what complications do you expect in such patients? What will happen to her if we don't treat it properly? Because look at her age, she's only 25.
Yeah. PID.
PID is number one. PID means PID can cause problems in two ways. First of
Yeah.
all, it is
Yeah.
causing pain, tenderness, and when there is discharge. Then, secondly, it is causing formation of adhesions. Why? By
Yes.
the surfaces they will be matting together. Okay, like, and then it can. What is PID? This is ascending infection from the cervix. It has come upwards and it has involved many organs. So this is an important cause of adhesions. Then it can distort the fallopian tubes. Then it is an important cause of ectopic
Subfertility.
pregnancy, tubal disease. So tubal disease, which is also again another cause of infertility. Okay, that is one thing. So that's why it is very important to treat these infections. What will happen if this infection persists? Patient
It
will
can
get
affect the. Mhm.
tubo-ovarian abscess, right? Patient is going to develop a tubo-ovarian abscess, which will be like a very bad condition if it progresses to that one. Okay, so for the abscess, we will have to drain that. Okay, because if there is a small abscess, the patient will not be symptomatic. But if it is symptomatic, then we need to remove it. That is one thing. Okay. So question number 7 says that a patient has undergone an infra-umbilical nephrotomy. Okay. So what is the chance
Yes.
of developing adhesions?
$75%.
Yes, 75%. Why would you say that?
Just I don't know. I
Oh,
just guessed the number. Not sure.
okay, don't worry. Because the point is that if we are giving like a vertical incision, so the risk of having adhesions is 50%, right? Actually, the
She,
answer should be the answer should be 55%. You know why? Because the point is that if the patient, that if we are giving, because anyhow this is a vertical incision, right? So in vertical incisions, this info has been taken from strategy and from um, some TOG articles. Okay, so if there is like financial incision, the risk of adhesion formation is 23%, and if there is a vertical incision, then the risk of adhesion is 55%. Okay, so this 75% in some operations, like there was like burst, viscera was there, and then nephrotomy was done. So since there is a chance of infection, so it may persist. But this one after midline incision, the chance it will not increase. Still, it is vertical incision. Okay, so C is the correct answer. They gave this number 75 to confuse you. Okay, So go to the number that is closer. So this 55%, that is closer to the effect. So we have to 50%, so we are going to choose this answer. So this is 50%.
Okay.
Okay, dear. So the next question is that a 45-year-old woman with a 6-month history of menorrhagia has been diagnosed with atypical endometrial hyperplasia. She declined any surgical management. So when you should arrange a follow-up. Here the thing which they kept from you is that if she didn't go for surgical management, then maybe she opted for medical management because she was having a problem, having was having menstrual bleeding. So we have so the point is that if she's having like heavy menstrual bleeding and she has atypical endometrial hyperplasia, so atypical means that the nucleus of the cells has been involved. So it means
Yes,
that
yeah.
we need to give her high dose progesterone. Okay. So we are giving high dose progesterone. The first line again is going to be levonorgestrel intrauterine device, intrauterine system, or Mirena. Or maybe she is taking like high dose of medroxyprogesterone acetate or norepinephrine. In any case, we need to see her again after 3 months.
3 months, yeah.
If she has endometrial hyperplasia without atypia, then we need to see her after 6 months. That is one thing. Okay. So so like
Yes.
she has like this is the algorithm for the management of endometrial hyperplasia. Like we are going to sample the endometrial cavity. So there can be two outcomes, like endometrial hyperplasia could be there without atypia, or it can be with atypia. So if it is without atypia, so we are going to address the risk factors, and if a patient is like refusing all treatments, you can offer her observation, but this is without atypia. But better, the first line treatment is that we should give levonorgestrel intrauterine system, or and the second line management is to give oral progestogens. So the chances are that this patient will improve, and then we are going to take this endometrial biopsy. This is endometrial hyperplasia, so we will take this biopsy at 6 months. Okay. Second outcome can be like you have sampled the endometrium, so patient has atypical hyperplasia. So atypical hyperplasia, the treatment of choice is to go for total abdominal hysterectomy and bilateral salpingo-oophorectomy. If you don't want this treatment, then we are going to do like she requires fertility, or the surgery is contraindicated because maybe she has some high risk conditions like an aesthetic score is not good, she cannot undergo the surgery, cannot tolerate it. So then we are going to manage her just like a case of endometrial hyperplasia without atypia. Okay, so we will give this treatment the same, but then we need to review her at 3 months. So when you are after giving the treatment, you are reviewing the patient. Then there are three possible outcomes. There could be regression, there could be persistence, or there can be progression. So if it has regressed, then we need to review the treatment. If the patient accepts this levonorgestrel intrauterine system, so we can continue it for 5 years, or we can give oral progestogens, and we need to stop after 6 months. And then if he's not improving, as a last resort, we will have to do something differently. So if the patient has completed her family and she has opted for surgery, then we are going to do TABSO. Okay. If the patient doesn't respond to treatment, he has ongoing abnormal uterine bleeding, then we should be offering, then we should be arranging follow-up, and we will have to see that what exactly is her condition. Okay. Ongoing bleeding, so we will manage that by TABSO, total abdominal hysterectomy, and bilateral salpingo-oophorectomy. So then we need to arrange follow-up. If there is endometrial hyperplasia, then we will see that is her BMI less than 35. BMI is less than 35, and on 2 occasions, and she has negative endometrial biopsy at 6 months intervals, then we are going to discharge her. But if the BMI is more than 35, or she has been treated with oral progestogens, then we are going for more than 2 consecutive negative endometrial biopsies at 6 months. And then after that, we are going to offer them annual endometrial biopsy and review. So every year, For the rest of the reproductive life, she is going to have this surveillance, okay, because her risk of developing this condition will be high. Risk of recurrence is high. If your patient has atypical hyperplasia, it means like 2 consecutive negative endometrial biopsies at 3-month intervals. Then after 6 to 12 months, we are going to do the endometrial biopsy and review her. So if he improves, again the same. If he improves, this is for the atypical hyperplasia. On more than two, we need 2 negative endometrial biopsies at 3-month intervals, and then at 6 months, then 12 months, and then we can review. That is one thing, okay. The second option is that we have done everything, patient is fine, so, but what happened now on the sampling, repeat sampling, there is persistence. Persistence means that the disease is the same, it is not increasing, it is not decreasing, so staying at the same level. So we need to review the treatment. If there is endometrial hyperplasia, then we should start medical treatment, and if observation has been, and we will advise total abdominal hysterectomy and bilateral salpingo-oophorectomy if it is persistent after 12 months of medical treatment. Read the question very carefully. If she has already received it for 12 months, then we are going to offer her this TAPSO. And then if she has like TAPSO, like she received treatment for 12 months and she had no atypia, but in 12 months her condition doesn't improve, then we need to do hysterectomy. And if the patient had atypical hyperplasia, we gave her chance, like we gave her like 3 months for surveillance and everything, but nothing happened. Okay? So what are we going to do? Obviously, we will have to do we TAPSO like that. Okay, that is one thing. Now the third group of women who have
sorry, in the first box,
your patient had atypical hyperplasia and she had 2 consecutive negative endometrial biopsies at 3-month intervals. Like first one at 3 months after stopping treatment, then again you are going to start after 3 months. That is negative, second negative biopsy. Then the third negative biopsy should be at 6 months, and the fourth negative biopsy will be at 12 months. So basically, she needs 4 negative biopsies. Initially every 3 months and then 6 months. And if she is not progressing, then we are going to discharge her. Is this point clear?
Yes,
it
it's
can
clear.
be like a bit complicated. So then if it is persistent, then we have, and she has simple endometrial hyperplasia, so we need to start medical treatment. If observation failed, and then we are going to advise total abdominal hysterectomy with PSO if persistence after 12 months of her medical treatment. And if she has like atypical hyperplasia, then we will advise total abdominal hysterectomy with the bilateral salpingo-oophorectomy. Okay. And what we will do with the sample, we will go to that in a while. The third group of patients, they had progression, so we need to review the treatment, and then we will see that if they have like atypical hyperplasia, then we are going to do TAPSO. And if there is like endometrial cancer, why? Because we took the biopsy again, and now we are looking at her. So if there is, you are suspecting endometrial cancer, then we need to send them to the, because there is endometrial carcinoma, because it is progressing. So what will be the result if there is atypical hyperplasia? TAPSO. Or maybe there can be endometrial carcinoma. How we will know? Of course, after the result of MRI. So if there is endometrial carcinoma, then we are going to send them to the cancer unit. So what they will do here? They will again, obviously, like we have done the TAPSO, we have done the histopathology, and the results have shown us that this is endometrial cancer. So if this patient has endometrial cancer, then they should be managed according to the cancer guidelines. But if it was progressing and we have done TAPSO, like you can see here the end result post TAPSO. So if there is no endometrial cancer at in the TAPSO, then we are going to review her at 6 weeks, and then we are going to discharge her. We are not reviewing her at 6 months. We are reviewing her only at 6 weeks at the post-op visit, because the source of problem we have removed that. Okay, so that's why we are not going to stay or not going to offer her a prolonged follow-up. So just do the TAPSO, review her at 6 weeks, and then discharge her. But if there is found to be endometrial cancer, then of course you need to manage that according to the local guidelines. Okay, so just follow this algorithm. And then another question they are going to ask you that which one is going to confer beneficial effects, continuous progesterone use or intermittent, like cyclical or the continuous use. Which one is beneficial?
Continuous.
Yeah, continuous, because if we are like giving them cyclically, then it is going to increase their chance of developing cancers. That is the problem. Okay. So here the patient has declined all treatments. Let's go over the question again. 45-year-old woman with 6-month history of menorrhagia, and she has been diagnosed with atypical endometrial hyperplasia, and she declined surgical management. So when you should arrange a follow-up? Just now we have read that even if the patient refuses any treatment, she doesn't want this medical treatment, she doesn't need this surgical treatment, everything she has refused. So we have the option of observation. So you will do that,
Yeah.
but still you need to follow her up. So when are you going to see her? After 3 months. So B is the correct answer here. That we are going to see her after 3 months.
3 months. Okay.
That is the point. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next question. Okay. So algebra 3 para 2 is in your office to discuss mode of delivery. Okay. So the first question would be that at how many weeks the birth plan should be finalized? Before 36 weeks, right? At 36 weeks, that is the last limit. Okay, so it should be in place. So this woman, she underwent an emergency cesarean section 4 years ago due to breech presentation. She delivered a healthy baby girl 2 years ago. And what are her chances of having a successful VBAC? So this is someone who has she has had a normal delivery VBAC after a cesarean section. So that is the single most important predictor. Like if she already had previous VBAC, then the guideline says, this is the guideline number 45, that her chance of having a successful VBAC, that is going to be 85 to 90%. 85 to 90%. So the answer will be E. Okay. So in the VBAC question.
So if it's 85, it's better to round it at 90. Yeah.
Yes, better, because actually if you will go to the guideline, it says 85 to 90%. That if the patient has previous one VBAC, beautifully written over there, that if patient has a previous the cesarean section, previous VBAC, then her chance of having another successful birth VBAC is 85 to 90%. So we are picking up 90%, because if they will give you here 80%, 85%, then you will pick up that one. Okay, but written in the guideline clearly 85 to 90%. So we will go to 82. We will go to E, 90%. Okay, the general points that you have to discuss. So if the woman is coming for VBAC, so she has to deliver in the obstetric unit. And the final decision about the mode of birth, it should be made and according to the before the expected planned date of delivery, but ideally it should be there before 36 weeks. Okay, and when you are making this decision for the elective repeat cesarean section, then they can ask you another question, that what percentage of patients can deliver before the planned date of the cesarean section. So your answer is 10%, because they will come into labor. So if they have to deliver by an elective repeat cesarean section, then their birth plan should be there, so that if the emergency occurs and they come to the hospital, so everything should be ready like that. They should know that how we are going to deliver this patient like that. Okay. So the risk benefit analysis you're going to do all the time. Both are associated with some benefits and some disadvantages. So women who are that the successful full VBAC, it has the lowest risk of complications. Okay, when they are choosing their mode of delivery. So we need to tell the woman that in cases of VBAC, what will happen, like we are giving a trial and then this trial has failed, so then we will have to do the emergency cesarean section, and this emergency cesarean section in cases of failed VBAC is going to be associated with the adverse outcomes. If we talk about the planned VBAC is associated with 1 in 200 or 0.5% risk of uterine rupture. Okay, VBAC, birth after C-section, and the risk is 0.5%. And that is if we did like transverse, like we gave Pfannenstiel incision, lower segment cesarean section. Okay, and then we should know that the risk of perinatal death in the VBAC is extremely low and comparable to the risk of a woman who is nulliparous and giving birth for the first time. Okay, and if we are doing elective repeat cesarean section, then there is going to be a slightly increased risk of having a placenta previa or accreta in the future pregnancy, which can complicate the abdominopelvic surgery in future. We need to tell them that the next time the surgery can be like very complicated like that. And then we have to tell them that in the cesarean section, there is a slightly increased risk in the respiratory morbidity when we are doing the cesarean section before 39 completed weeks of pregnancy. So the risk of respiratory morbidity, it can be reduced with a pre-operative course of antenatal corticosteroids. Sometimes the question that patient is going for cesarean section, so when are you going to offer? So what should be offered now? So even at 38 weeks plus 6 days, we need to give them, better if we will give them antenatal corticosteroids like that. So then the other comparison like planned VBAC, what are the maternal outcomes? 72 to 75% chance of successful VBAC. And if it is successful, it is associated with shorter hospital stay. So if we are doing like elective repeat section from 39 weeks of pregnancy, so here we can say that we should be able to plan a known delivery date in select patients, and we need to tell the patient that 10% they can go in labor without before that date. Then 0.5% risk of uterine scar rupture. If it occurs, it is associated with maternal morbidity and the fetal morbidity and mortality. And virtually, if we are doing the ERCS, then virtually we are avoiding the risk of having uterine rupture like that. And the actual risk is very low, like less than 0.02. So that's why they don't ask you question about it, because if you're doing an elective repeat section, chance of ruptured uterus just 0.2%. Okay? And then we know that longer recovery, patient has to stay here for longer period of time, and it reduces the risk of pelvic organ prolapse and the respiratory and the urinary symptoms. But only in the short term, and as the number of cesareans increases, then the risk of having these problems after 3 sections is equal to that woman who is giving normal birth. And then if they are seeking like sterilization at the same time, so they should be counseled appropriately. So why it is so? Because they should give consent freely and at least 2 weeks before the procedure. Because if we are doing the BTL in this emergency scenario, then the regret rate is going to be very high. That's why we need to tell them. So if the woman has delivered by a normal birth, VBAC is successful, then the chance of having a future VBAC will increase to 85 to 90%.
90%.
And in the future pregnancies, if we are doing like repeat cesarean sections, then in the future pregnancies, the chance of having placenta previa and accreta, it is also increasing. And even the abdominopelvic surgery is going to be complicated. So in the case of normal birth, the chance of maternal death is 4 in 100,000, and like it is very low. And the case of death, maternal death, in cases of the cesarean section it is 13 in 100,000. So you can see the risk is increasing by at least threefold, more than threefold actually. Okay. Regarding the fetal outcomes, in the SBD, the VBAC, the risk of transient respiratory morbidity is 2 to 3%, while the same risk if the baby is taking birth the chance of respiratory morbidity is going to be 4 to 5%. So you can see that it is
45%.
higher than the SVD. Why? Because when the babies are passing through the birth canal, excessive fluid into the fetal lungs, it is taken out. Okay, it is
Yeah.
squeezed out, but this doesn't happen in cases of the repeat cesarean section. So the chance of RDS is high. So we need to give them corticosteroids. So then, in the infant, regarding the chance of stillbirth, that is also 10 per 10,000, 0.1%, but they will give you this number. Chance of stillbirth is 10 in 10,000 before beyond 39 weeks of pregnancy. Before 39 weeks, we don't know the risk, but after 39 weeks, it is going to be 10%. And then the chance of, this is also all of these, pay attention to this table.
10%, is it?
That is 10 per 10,000. That is the chance of stillbirth. Like if we are not doing cesarean section by 39th week of gestation, then we are increasing the chance of putting the patient at higher risk of stillbirth. So the chance of stillbirth is 10 births per 10,000. That is one point. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So similarly, the chance of like a delivery related perinatal death in the normal delivery, it is going to be 4 per 10,000. Like if you remember, when we were talking about the intrapartum care, then we said that if the families are laboring at home, the chance of transfer of the baby to the hospital is increasing. Right? So that is 4 in 10,000. Okay. So regarding the chance of hypoxic ischemic and
Was it 8% the increase in the transfer? I can't remember.
This one.
Can't remember the name.
Yeah, that was
Okay.
4 in
Yeah.
10,000. Look at this one. The risk of hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy is 8 in 10,000. They like to ask you this question, okay? And high chance in cases of normal and spontaneous vaginal delivery. And the chance of hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy in the elective repeat cesarean sections, that is less than 0.01%, like 1 per 10,000. Here it is 0.08% or 8 in 10,000. All these rates are in 10,000, okay, because the number is very small. If you will make it in percent in the 100, then the number is going to be very, very low, like 0.01, 0.08. That is one thing, okay. So now if we go, so here they have elaborated on the same point, so no need to cover them. Just we are going to talk about it. So this is the paragraph I was telling you about. Look at this one. Okay. So women with one or more previous vaginal births, they should be informed that the previous vaginal delivery, particularly previous VBAC, is the single best predictor of successful VBAC, and it is associated with a planned VBAC success rate of 85 to 90%. And previous vaginal delivery is also independently associated with a reduced risk of uterine rupture. So that's why we pick that number 90% like that. So that is important for you. Then here they have asked that what are the chances of like when the VBAC is likely to fail. Like the VBAC is likely to fail if the chance of the weight of the baby is like more than 4 kg, inter-delivery interval is less than 2 years, and BMI of the woman is more than 30.
30.
Okay, and successful VBAC is more likely to be more successful in these conditions. We'll just go over these. Like the highest chance of success if the previous section was done due to fetal malpresentation, like 84%. Okay, and if the cesarean section was done due to liver dystocia, like that she didn't progress beyond a certain point, then the chance of success is going to be 64%. Okay, if the previous section was done due to fetal distress, then the chance of successful VBAC is 73%. That is one thing. Okay, and then there was another figure, like if all the factors like cervical dystocia was there, and then this fetal distress was there, and now there is a male baby is there, then the chance of successful VBAC is going to be just like 40%. Okay, because the chance will decrease tremendously. Like if 2 or 3 factors will be there, read the question very carefully. Okay, If several factors
Okay.
are present, like more than 2 or 3 factors are present, then the chance of planned VBAC it will decrease. Okay. And if
Okay.
it comes with a combination of 3 factors, the chance of successful VBAC will be only like, it will be like very low, like that. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And here in the guideline is written 40%. Okay. Then
Okay.
another thing is that what features are suggestive of the uterine rupture. Abnormal CTG is the first finding, but it is you are going to see that in 66 to 76% of these events. Okay, and that
Mm-hmm.
is important. So then most of the uterine ruptures they will occur during labor, and the peak incidence when the dilatation is at 4 to 5 centimeter cervical dilation. So 18% they will occur in the second stage of labor, and 8% they will be identified after delivery. So like 18% they will occur in the second stage, like fully dilated to pushing of the baby, birth
Question.
of the baby, and 8% they will be identified in the post vaginal delivery because the rupture has occurred like that. Okay, so these are the clinical features which are associated with ruptured scar rupture, like abnormal CTG, which is seen in 66 to 76%. Then severe abdominal pain, especially if it is persisting in between contractions, then acute onset of the scar tenderness, then abnormal vaginal bleeding, hematuria, then cessation of previously efficient uterine activity, now the uterus is silent, and the maternal tachycardia, hypotension, fainting or shock, and the loss of station of the presenting part. Then change in abdominal contour and inability to pick up fetal heart tones and the old at the old transducer site. So all of these complications they can occur like that. Okay? Risk of uterine rupture is zero point 0.2 to zero point 0.4 like that. When you're reaching a VPAC, then it's going
0.5.
to be 0.2 to 0.2 to zero point 0.5. That is the risk. Okay? So these numbers are important for you because they can ask you about it. Okay? And then it is also important, sometimes they are asking that in what percentage of patients the scar dehiscence is going to be asymptomatic, that is 48%. So when we will say that this is rupture and this is dehiscence, when the serosa is covering the uterus, then we will say that this is dehiscence. Okay, but if the serosa is also
Yeah.
gone, then we will say that this is a rupture.
Complete.
So the
Yeah.
simple definitions, but you need to remember them. That is important for you. Okay. So
So if
these
the
are all.
serosa is intact, this is dehiscence. If serosa
Yes,
is not intact,
yes, that is the point. That is
it's
the point.
eruption.
Okay. So that's why these things are important. Okay. So going back to the question. Okay. Okay. Question number 10. Debra 2 pen 1 is at 20 weeks gestation. Ultrasound was done, and she has been found to have a low-lying placenta. So in what percentage of such patients the placental migration is likely to take place? So as we know that if the placenta is low-lying, then what will happen? As the lower segment it will enlarge. So what will happen? And the
It
placenta will
will
be moving up.
move, yeah.
Yeah, moving up, and then we say that the placenta also grows in size and it moves upwards, like the lower edge is like it is regressing and the upper edge is progressing. That's why we said migration. So like in 90% of the cases what happens, the placenta moves up. The guideline has given the word exactly 90%. Okay, so what happens, like apparently what happens, like the patient is asymptomatic and the placenta it moves up. So that before term. So when is the term? Term is at 37 weeks. Okay.
7.
So at 37 weeks, at 36 weeks, when we are scanning them, then we will see that 90% of the placentas they have moved up like that. So only remaining 10% they will have like persistently low this placenta, and then we will have to manage them differently. That is one thing. Okay. So the next
Yeah.
question is, this question they have asked many times, and some it is confusing the candidates all the time. And expect to answer many questions on the mental health issue. Okay, so
Okay.
question number 11, a pregnant woman, she has been taking lithium for controlling her bipolar disorder. So how much likely she is to develop postpartum depression? So she has bipolar disorder. Having bipolar disorder means that at one end of the spectrum she is very happy, she is maniac, and at the other end of the spectrum she is so much depressed that she is showing no interest in her life and nothing. Okay, and as the condition deteriorates, what happens? The gap between the maniac and the depressive episodes, it decreases. Okay, so we are going to see very fast movement between cycling between the depressive and the maniac episode. So just to slow them down, we give them lithium. So these patients like who are already very likely to develop depression because they are swinging between two conditions, right? Mania and depression. So what is the chance that they will develop postpartum depression? So people think
B.
that the chance is going to be very high. So it is. So what is your answer?
B, I think.
It is like
No.
D. You know why? Because what happens in such patients is that between the postpartum, the question is postpartum psychosis. Postpartum psychosis, not depression. In depression, yes, 50%, okay. But the question is that can they develop psychosis? Because depression, we already know that depression is already there. So the chance that how many of them are going to develop psychosis. So the risk of
1 in 4.
psychosis, yeah, 1 in 4. That is the chance of developing psychosis like that, okay. And if they ask you the similar patient, she has the same patient. So here the answer for this question is D, like that, okay. Now the same
Okay.
patient has family history of having having this bipolar disorder, okay. So then what is the chance of developing this one? It
B.
is family history also. So 1 in 2, 50%, okay. If she has
Yeah.
family history, the chance will increase to 50%, okay, like that. So that is important. Okay, so there is one guide when we will go to this antenatal care and also given in the maternal medicine. Um, summary of this nice guideline on mental health issues. Just go over that. Okay, one very short form is also there, like what will happen, what are the likely chances. Very short document is there, and then one detailed document is there. But just revise that 1 week before your exam, okay? Because you are going to get many questions from there. Because mental health is, as a is a serious challenge. That's why you are going to get many things from there. That is one thing. Okay.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
okay, question number 12. A 32-year-old woman has been admitted to the labor ward and the midwife has noticed some shallow ulcers on her vulva. Woman has experienced it for the very first time in her life. So what is the risk of transmission to the new baby? So if this is the first episode, then we accept. Actually, in the exam, you have to accept the things the patient is telling you. We
Okay.
don't
Yeah.
have to doubt them. So she's telling you that this is the first time, so this is a primary episode of herpes. So if she has like
Yeah.
primary episode, then the risk of transmission to the fetus is 41% in the vaginal delivery, right? And
Yeah. How many weeks is she here?
she is in labor. Weeks they didn't
Live.
tell you. She's already in labor
Okay.
like that, okay? So we are going to give her, so this is the first episode, so the risk of transmission of herpes to the inside baby is 40%, right? 41% actually. And if had it been the recurrent episode, then what would have been the chance of getting infection for the baby? That will be 1 to
5 to
2%,
10.
0
Okay.
to 0 to 3%. Okay, in all viral infections and almost in all bacterial and the protozoal infection, the risk of transmission of infection to the baby is like 0 to 3%. That is the safe bet. Okay, because
Okay.
anyhow they are transmitted to the babies, but we should know the number. So these are just estimates because maybe the baby is like at a higher risk, like the mother has high risk behavior, So many things you must have seen, that you can see a mixture of so many different factors, so many different things like that. Okay. Okay, so that is going to be for even for the CMV, then in cases of toxoplasmosis, syphilis, then chickenpox, the same numbers.
Chicken pox, yeah.
The same numbers, like
0.3, from 0 to 3%.
in
Yeah.
in the recurrent, and up to 40% in the primary episode if it occurs during pregnancy. Okay. The next question is that 30-year-old Grabner 3 para 0 plus 2 at 14 weeks of gestation has presented to ANC clinic. She had both miscarriages at 10 and 11 weeks of pregnancy. Ultrasound scan reveals a cervical length of 10 millimeter. So what would be best step in her next best step in her management? So first of all, determine here. So this is an incidental finding, right? Because the miscarriages she's having, they occurred in the first trimester, not in the second one.
Not in the late second.
Not in the late second. So so maybe her cervix is inherently like this, just 10 millimeter. So should we offer her any cervical circlage? Should we offer high dose progesterone suppositories? No, she's not a high risk. Reassurance? No, that will be false reassurance. We have no clue. Should we offer serial ultrasound? Probably we should do that. And should we repeat scan at 20 weeks gestation and do cervical circlage? So of course we need to scan her 20 weeks, but we will offer circlage then or not. We have not reached the bridge, right? So the option will be serial ultrasound. We cannot reassure her also. Why? Because this is less, so we need to just see that how she is behaving. The point here they wanted to ask you was that are you going to start high dose progesterone, or are you going to start going to offer this cervical circlage? So in a way it's a tricky question, because everyone who is having like 10 millimeter, we are not going to suture that, though the NICE guideline says that if it is less than like 25 millimeter, just apply cervical suture, cervical stitch. But in the history there are 2 first trimester miscarriages, but then the NICE says that if it is less than 25 millimeter, then you should offer circular. So what will you like to do for this patient?
Why not offer progesterone?
Yeah, we can offer her high dose progesterone suppositories. Okay, because she had miscarriages at 10 and the 11 weeks. Now she is at 14 weeks. Okay, so circlage is one of the options, but here the confusing point. Why this is confusing? Because this patient has no history of any like a second trimester miscarriage. Okay, but the point is that if you will go to the NICE guideline on the preterm labor, it says that anytime the cervical length is less than 25 millimeter, we need to apply cervical circlage. So or we can give them high dose progesterone like that. Okay, so as such, so we will not offer her this one. We can offer her high dose progesterone. That makes some sense like that. Okay, because the problem is that applying this cervical circlage is also associated with certain risks. What risks? Like I
don't know. I think I was late miscarriage.
Yeah, they had history of anything. The problem with this patient is that we have not done, like she has no history of any late second term miscarriage. No miscarriage after like this 24 weeks of pregnancy, or no miscarriage in the second trimester. Because there is specific criteria, like there should be like the shortening of the cervix and there should be some history. So this is just incidental finding like that. And this patient, the first 2 trimesters, they were at 10 and 11 weeks. So the question remains that should we or we should not?
Yeah, so result from transvaginal ultrasound scan carried out between of pregnancy, those show cervical lengths. Okay.
Yes.
But it says a history of a spontaneous preterm birth and result of. So it has to be 2 factors.
Yeah, it has to be 2 factors.
Which she doesn't fit
Yeah.
this criteria. She
That
doesn't
is the
have these 2
problem.
factors.
But then another thing is, the other thing is that she is at 14 weeks of gestation, right? So 14 weeks, why they gave you 14 weeks? To confuse you, because after completing the 13th week, she went to the 14th week, and then they're asking you. So better answer there will be that we should do the ultrasound after 2 weeks, and then we should see that it is like 25 millimeter or less. In that case, because the next point is that are we going to give her progesterone or are we going to apply the surplatch? So that decision will come later. This woman is still at 14 weeks, and the ideal time of applying the surplatch is between 16 and 24 weeks. Okay, that is the ideal time. Mostly, if you will go and review your case files, you must have seen that we are applying around 15 or 16 weeks. Okay, that is like with each passing week, you are getting this idea that now the pregnancy is going to be the safer side. That is one thing. Okay? And in any situation, we are going to give her a benefit of doubt. If the things are not given there, then we are not going to make up the things like that. Okay, like we will not say that maybe we will let her continue like this and then we will apply this rescue surplatch. So it doesn't go that way. So you have diagnosed her at 15 weeks, so still you need to review her after 2 weeks at 16 weeks, and then we can offer her applying this surplatch, because the guideline it says that we can apply between 16 and 27 weeks. Actually, this question I remember they asked this patient that admit this patient for surplatch. So that's how they confuse the student that apply this, admit this patient. Okay, offer it was not offer, it was like, because these are only recalls, it was admit her for surplatch. Then admit her for conservative management, give her high dose progesterone. So this high dose progesterone, it was not there. They said that admit the patient for conservative management. So we don't admit the patient for conservative management. So then by the process of elimination, like it will be like this, and that if I make this question like this, that admit and offer, so then obviously it will be wrong if we don't admit anyone for these things. Okay, then the second option I make like admit and offer, then obviously these options, these two will be excluded. Okay, reassurance, no, that will be wrong. And then repeating the scan at 20 weeks, by that time maybe she would have already aborted, so pay attention to the wording. So we are left with one option, serial ultrasound. Serial ultrasound means that we are going to do it fortnightly. That is the point. Okay, so we will keep this answer D, that we will offer her serial ultrasound. Okay, any confusion, anything about it?
No, it's okay. Yeah.
Okay. So the question number 14 reads, a 38-year-old para 1 has been experiencing heavy menstrual bleeding for 3 years now, and her cycles are regular, but now she is passing blood clots too. Endometrial biopsy has been reported as endometrial hyperplasia without atypia, and she is not planning her second pregnancy anytime soon. So what is the best management of her condition at this stage? So we know that she is coming for the treatment, and the number one option is to give insert levonorgestrel. So your clue here is like we can go in any direction. Like we could have given her the drugs also, but the first line, and that is going to be convenient, and she's not, and they confused you that she's planning a pregnancy, but she's not planning a pregnancy right now. That is the thing, right?
Yeah.
So that's why we will stick with the answer A, like endometrial, and we have just done the guideline on the endometrial hyperplasia like that. This TAPSO is not an option. Total abdominal hysterectomy, or this is not an option. The COCPs, that is going to be like, the problem here is conflict between the nice guideline, but that guideline is on heavy menstrual bleeding, and there the first line drugs, all of these like LNG, COCPs, and then and the tranexamic acid, they are first line. Okay, but this patient has endometrial hyperplasia. So for the endometrial
So here we are following the hyperplasia guideline, not the heaviness rule.
Yeah, so we are following the heavy this endometrial hyperplasia guideline. So we have to give the LNG or we have to give the hydroxyprogesterone acetate, that is PMA high dose for 90 days. And we are usually not giving for 90 days, we are giving for 180 days if there is endometrial hyperplasia. We are giving for 90 days if there is atypical endometrial hyperplasia, then you are giving for 90 days and then you are going to review her. So many things. So that's why it's very, very important to be like fully oriented when you are taking your exam. Why? Because it can cause like multiple problems. So we have to be alert. Okay, that is important.
Okay.
So the next question is very confusing. 27-year-old primary gravida at 36 weeks of gestation, she has presented to the ER due to severe occipital headache and vomiting for 6 hours. So examination revealed papilledema, that is edema of the optic disc, which points towards hypertension, but there are other space occupying tumors. So many things can be there. She has focal neurological signs. Focal neurological signs like maybe the arm is not moving, maybe there is loss of reflex, loss of sensation, and neck stiffness. So she experienced convulsions an hour ago, and her blood pressure is 140/90, no albuminuria, and the temperature is 37 degrees centigrade. And her cerebral angiogram revealed a Barrett's aneurysm, which is located in the region of the right middle cerebral artery. So what is the most likely diagnosis? So Barrett's aneurysm, congenital weakness in the wall of the blood vessels. And then she has neck stiffness. So neck will be stiff if there is blood in the meninges. So this is not migraine, this is not epilepsy, this is not CVT, because all of these they are associated with convergence, they can occur, right? But this one point, like she has focal neurological deficits and she has neck stiffness. So neck stiffness, it goes in favor of subarachnoid hemorrhage because there is blood between the meninges. So subarachnoid hemorrhage, that is like a very important cause of hemorrhage. And actually, in the RCOG it is different, but actually the patient like we will go to the American system or the Canadian system. The problem is that there in the American and the Canadian system, they say that the worst headache of one's life, that is because of the subarachnoid hemorrhage. But in the RCOG, they say thunderclap headache, that is because of subarachnoid hemorrhage. It is misnomer, but that's how the people have developed the ideas. In the RCOG, if somebody says that she is experiencing the worst headache of her life, that is going to be cavernous sinus thrombosis. Write it down. This is the differentiating point. Okay. And in the rest of the world,
okay, so it's different.
Yeah, it is different. So in the rest of the world, if somebody says that she's experiencing the worst headache of her life, that is actually subarachnoid hemorrhage.
And in the RCOG, is it on the RCOG website that it's cerebral venous thrombosis?
And then, and then it is given in the TOG article that is present. Many TOG articles are there in the maternal medicine, like the headaches during pregnancy is one of them. Headache during pregnancy is a very important topic. Okay, just go over that one, and it is given in the folder on maternal medicine. Very important topic. Just don't read the full document, just the important points. So the management of the diagnosis, how do we make it? Like we have to do the CT, we have to do MRI, and then lumbar puncture also, because then we have to do like angiography. Sometimes we have to do, that is the gold standard, which is going to tell you that where the hemorrhage has occurred and why it has occurred like that. Okay. Then the management, we have to make a multidisciplinary team. So the neurologist should be there, neurosurgeon should be there, and then the obstetrician should be there. So here, there is no place for the conservative management. So we need to do the surgery and we need to remove the clot, need to fix the blood vessel, and then we have to.
So here, Here in the question, they say convulsions. It couldn't be epilepsy. Yeah? No?
Couldn't be like that because they have tried to confuse you. BP is normal like that, right? And convulsions, but in epilepsy, nobody is going to have like the neck stiffness. And then the epilepsy, there will be history and this papilledema. So papilledema is there, so it means that something is there like that. Okay. And whenever they tell you like why they have told you about the occipital headache, because in the PET also mostly the patients will have occipital headache like that. Okay, that is one thing like that. So this patient will need urgent surgery, and we will not offer cesarean section. And then the anti-hypertensive drugs, yes, they need to be given here. And then this condition is as such not associated with higher chance of like this fetal death or something. Sometimes the patient, this patient is like this one has developed full-fledged this bleeding and everything. But what happens is in the exam, like this patient will be disoriented somewhat. Like when this leakage has not occurred, she will not be remembering many things. She will be disoriented, okay? She will be dizzy like that, despite having this high BP. Why? Because the circulation, this cerebral circulation is not maintained. That is the problem. Okay? So now we have another question. Question number 16. 34-year-old woman, she had a spontaneous vaginal delivery outside hospital, and she is running high-grade fever and receiving antibiotics. She complains of abdominal pain, so which of the following analgesics should not be prescribed for her? So it's a simple question. We know that in cases of infection, we don't have to give non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Why we don't give it to them? Because whenever there is infection, then inflammatory markers, they are released, like interleukins 1-6, and the healing process will start. Okay, then this WBCs, when the WBCs are affected, then they will follow this process of diabetes, and they will go through the pores into the blood vessels walls. Okay, so this ability of the WBCs to navigate through the blood vessels and go to the site of infection, that is arrested by these NSAIDs, so they cannot fight infections in an efficient way. That is the reason that we don't want to give these drugs to someone who has developed infections like that. NSAIDs, so that's why we are not giving. So what can we give to them? We can give them codeine, we can give them methylene, morphine, because they have no reaction they have no action on the WBCs like that. And tell me about another condition when you will not give NSAIDs.
Epilepsy.
Why epilepsy? Ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. Okay, in ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, we will not give it to them. Why? Because they will decrease the renal blood flow.
Yeah.
That is why. Okay, so and the renal perfusion is already poor, so we don't want to give it to anyone like that. Okay.
Sorry, in epilepsy. Sorry, I'm.
Yeah, in epileptic. Different things. I got your point. In sickle cell disease and in the thalassemia and in those who are epileptics, we don't give them morphine. Why? Because morphine is a good analgesic. Morphine we are giving, but we are not giving pethidine. Why? Because pethidine will lower the threshold for seizure activity. So the patient will have convulsions at lower threshold. That's why we don't give them pethidine. So morphine is a better analgesic in these circumstances because it is more potent and it doesn't lower the threshold for these convulsions. That is the reason. Is it clear?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So the next question, 48-year-old para 4 woman with a complaint of heavy menstrual bleeding which is associated with passage of clots, and she has presented to your clinic, and on abdominal ultrasound the uterus looks bulky and endometrial thickness is found to be 8 millimeter, and her cycles are regular, occurring every 29 days. So what is the next step in her management? So this is someone like those kind of stories here in front of you shows. So she is 48, like that. Okay, so she is in the perimenopausal age group. So actually here the conflict will be that the new guideline on the heavy menstrual bleeding says that we have to offer hysteroscopy and endometrial sampling. So here they are asking you that, so you have to make a choice between B and D. B says outpatient endometrial sampling, and D means says outpatient hysteroscopy. So what should be done for this patient? So hysteroscopy, okay, we are going to visualize, but is it going to help us in making the decision for her? Decision of management?
No. I think B, the outpatient endometrial sampling.
So why so sampling, you know, when you have to do the sampling, you can do that as outpatient only, okay? Like we will do it, we will take the sample, but under hysteroscopy. But in anyhow, even if we are going to do the hysteroscopy, the aim of hysteroscopy is to get the sample, right? Why so outpatient endometrial sampling? Whenever we are doing like diagnostic procedures, we can do them in the OPD. All diagnostic procedures we can do in the outpatient setting like that. And the diagnostic, the therapeutic procedures you need to do inside OR. That is the point. Okay.
So the answer is always hysteroscopy and endometrial biopsy.
Yeah, but they didn't give you both together.
Then, because with the hysteroscopy you can do both of them, but with endometrial sampling you can't do that.
Yeah, but in the question they are not giving you like this. So your answer will be that you will go for that hysteroscopy will be that visualization will be important, or more important to get the tissue diagnosis. Because tissue diagnosis, why it is important? Tissue diagnosis is important because your further management, it depends on it, that what exactly was there. What do you think?
I don't know. From what I recall from the in the course, yeah.
Yeah, mostly it is people, so you will go for outpatient hysteroscopy because, like you said, you can take the sample in both situations like that.
Yes, yeah.
So people, we are not doing that. Okay. So that is the point. So we need to see and then we need to treat. So the answer will be D, outpatient hysteroscopy. Okay. So the question number 18. A 24-year-old woman presents to your clinic due to fever and nausea, and her temperature is 39. So an IUCD was inserted last month for contraception, and urinalysis is negative for nitrites or estrogens. Okay, that is the point. So it means that there is no urinary infection. Okay. So she has, like, she's symptomatic, she has fever, she has nausea, and she doesn't have UTI. So what it could be? Like ectopic pregnancy. What is the most likely diagnosis? Ectopic pregnancy, urinary tract infection, inflammatory bowel disease, pelvic infection, or none of the above.
She has IUCD, so there is a risk of ectopic pregnancy. But she is young as well. There is a risk of pelvic infection.
Yeah, so pelvic infection. We'll go with that because if the patient is 125, that's why, deliberately they kept the age 24.
Yeah.
So if the patient is less than 25, think about pelvic infections, because the highest incidence in the 18 to 25 age group. That is the reason. Okay. The next question, 19, 65-year-old woman. She underwent a total abdominal hysterectomy due to vaginal bleeding. Histopathology results, they showed endometrial cancer stage 1 involving less than 50% of the endometrial thickness. So what should be done next? So do we need to offer her radio, chemo, lymphadenectomy, hormone therapy, or no further action?
I will give her radiotherapy.
No, don't give that, because that is less than 50%. Okay, less than 50%, stage 1A. So no further treatment. Okay, just this patient will just go for follow-up, because they're asking because they didn't give us the option of follow-up here, right? So that's why we'll tell her that she will just go for this, no action is required, so only follow-up is essential for her. That is one thing. Okay, that is one thing. Okay, sometimes the questions, they can be like very confusing like that, so we should know about that. So this question they are always asking. I don't know why they are asking the UK people, but this is maybe for the people like who are coming from overseas. Like Trial College of OB/GYN exam, it has membership exam, it has like a written part too, and then it has like one oral part also, like the clinical examination. Okay, so why it shows, so what type of assessment is this one?
Summative.
Summative. Why? Because we are ending it at one point and we are going to the next level. So whenever we have this type of assessment, we call it summative assessment. That is one. Okay. So then question number 21. 70-year-old woman. She has presented to gynecology clinic with persistent vulval pain. On inspection, the clinician sees redness, fissures, erosions, ulcerations, and hypopigmentation. A diagnosis of localized vulvodynia is made, and so what is the most likely etiology of this condition? So she has redness, fissures, erosions, ulcerations, hypopigmentation. They didn't say that there is whitening, and she is 70 like that.
Lichen sclerosis.
So in cases of lichen sclerosis, there should be redness will be there, but in the very initial stages. Okay. Now it can present with vulval pain, but the most common complaint will be if he has lichen sclerosis. So what will be the most common complaint? If there are erosions, redness, there is fissuring, hypopigmentation, and the problem is that they didn't give us the duration, otherwise it will be easier for us. And then localized, it means that only when they are touching it, then the pain is provoked. Okay, cannot be HPV, because HPV will cause intractable itching. Okay. And then smoking, why they are saying smoking? Because smoking is associated with so many different problems, even HPV. If she is doing this pelvic floor muscle paining, then it should not be causing the changes. It is not VIN because we don't see any fissures. The most common symptom of a VIN will be severe pruritus, which is like experienced by 70% patients, but 38% they will say that they have really very, very bad itching. So recurrent vulvovaginal candidiasis. When you see the word redness and it has been there for some time, think about this candidiasis. Okay, that is
okay.
So these are the questions. So I think we can stop here.